Good morning to all of you. We're going to have a treat today, and I want to welcome you to this lecture on the just-in-case plan, how Western Canada small businesses can prepare for the potential for the end of Nafta. And that our speaker today is Carlo Dade, who has come to us from the Canada West Foundation. He's the director of the Trade and Investment Centre at the Canada West Foundation, which is based in Calgary. All of you, I think, have a pretty good history on Johnson Sciama, so I won't dwell on that, but it's obviously a graduate school of public policy based in Regina and Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, the U of S campus. At this time, I want to acknowledge that today's event is taking place on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territory, assuming that Saskatoon is part of the equation, and the traditional home of the Métis. I'm Doug Moen. I'm the Director of Executive Education here at JSGS. Today, the school is extremely pleased to welcome Carlo Dade. And I just want to give you a bit of a sense of what he's been up to. He is, as I say, the Director of Trade and Investment, the Trade Investment Centre at Canada West Foundation. Carlo Dade develops and leads research to promote growth and profitability in Western Canada's export economy. Carlo has a long history in international public policy, most recently as a senior fellow in the University of Ottawa's School of International Development and senior associate at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He's also a member of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations. Carlo has been a leading voice in debates on recent Canadian free trade agreements and the development of trade infrastructure. He has a reputation for big picture thinking and is a leading global expert on Pan-Pacific trade, including the Trans-Pacific Partnership and Pacific Alliance trade blocs. He's one of the leading commentators on North American competitiveness and Canada-Mexico relations. And he is a highly sought-after media commentator. If you watch the trade news in Canada, you'll see Carlo's name. You'll see Carlo's face pop up from time to time as he is commenting in the national news and in other places. And I'm on the board of Canada West Foundation, so I'm particularly pleased to be able to welcome him to Johnson Sciama. So what we're going to do is we're going to have his lecture today. You're going to have a chance then to ask a few questions, and we'll just have a bit of a debate. We've got the right size of group where we can have a really good discussion, and I'll turn it over to Carlo. Please welcome him. Over to you, my friend.
Thank you, Doug. Thanks for the invitation, Doug and Kathy, for getting me to Johnson Sciama. I think, God, Matt and I were trying to find our way, and we went up the wrong stairway. And I'm suddenly thinking, hold on, I've been here half a dozen times. Let me stop and think for a second. And I was able to think back to the last time I was here 2 years ago and figure out how to get us on the right track. So it's not the first time I've been here. It won't be the last. So yes, it's always a pleasure to be here. Doug did mention, thank you, that you are on the board of Canada West. So this is one of the more difficult types of talks or lectures you give. You know, your boss's boss is in the room. So should you screw up or curse, which has been known to happen, or do something else, when you get back to the office, your boss is sitting there waiting for you. Got a second? I'd like to talk to you. So that's going to make this a little more restrained than the presentation I did for government yesterday, probably. So I suppose we can go through the...
I hope that's not true.
Oh, you know it's true. So the talk I was going to give is based on some work that we've done in Canada West, and I'll go through what Canada West is to situate this. Situated in the neoclassical and the neoliberal perspective of analysis. No, sorry. We're not going to be doing that sort of thing. But situate the talk in Canada West and what we do. But the work that we've done here was designed specifically for SMEs, small and medium enterprises in Western Canada that are trading with the U.S., but don't have either the resources or the size to afford information, intelligence, and advice from the large consulting firms like Dentons or Ben & Jones the larger companies, the large corporations that trade, have access to this resource, or they have in-house staff. It was designed for the firms that can't afford a Bennett Jones or don't have in-house staff to advise them on NAFTA, and also for companies that aren't part of large supply and production chains. So someone that's a supplier to Ford that gets information from the Ford Motor Company about NAFTA negotiations and how what's happening will impact the smaller supplier that's part of the larger production or supply chain. That leaves a large swath of companies in Canada that lack those two sources of information. We know that 10 to 12% of Canadian SMEs export. And of that 10 to 12%, 85 export only to the United States. So you can imagine the potential here, the potential audience that is lacking information about NAFTA and also information about how to proceed. So the goal of this exercise that we conducted was to do two things. It was to provide information for the firms to mitigate what they're hearing in the news. And if you see the news, we're now dealing with a U.S. administration that formulates policy by tweet and, in essence, fear. That works very well in the news cycle for selling papers and getting people to watch broadcasts. But if you're a business that's actually engaged in trade with the U.S., that's not the way you want to get your information. Yet, for a lot of firms, this is what they're seeing. Tweet to tweet, up, down, back, forth. It's utterly confusing. And to the firms with whom we spoke, it can be utterly terrifying. So we wanted to provide information to kind of mitigate that. When I hear the tweets, I roll my eyes 90% of the time because I know what's behind the tweet and what the limits to what the U.S. administration can do, et cetera, et cetera. But the small business person that doesn't have that information is not going to be rolling their eyes. They're going to be extremely worried. And the decisions that you can make out of misinformation, panic, are some of the worst decisions you can make in business. So one goal was to provide information to mitigate those impacts. The second was to actually provide concrete, practical advice for steps that small businesses could take in response to what we're seeing with NAFTA. So to mitigate the fear with information and to mitigate the fear with action and to position companies to be able to respond to what we're seeing in North America. But as part of this exercise, what was really fascinating is as we talked to companies, and you'll see this as we go through the presentation, this will make sense about 3/4 of the way through. But as we talked to firms, the discussions about NAFTA were a transition to thinking about new trade opportunities for some fairly obvious reasons. And so the guide has morphed from being just a discussion on how to deal with NAFTA, but how to transition into a world beyond NAFTA, or what I'm calling the end of NAFTA. And so that has several meanings. It's a double entendre, the end of NAFTA, and we'll be able to explain it in the presentation. So that's essentially what we're going to try to do today. And again, I'm going to take the talk and change it quite a bit. If this was a talk for entrepreneurs or businesses, I'd go in one direction, but I'm going to take it in a slightly more policy direction for you guys. And if you something really interesting, something where you want to dive down the rabbit hole, feel free to stop. And if I'm going to dive down that rabbit hole later in the presentation, I'll let you know. But if I'm not, feel free to stop and we can go down that rabbit hole and answer some questions or explore a topic in depth that I might just blow through on my way to something else. So, Canada West Foundation, as Doug mentioned, he's on the board. We were created 40 years ago. And you ever, when you're watching those YouTube videos or videos on the web, and before the video starts, you get that commercial that pops up and says, your video will start in 5 or 7 seconds. Yeah, sorry. This is at 5 or 7 seconds, but before the video starts. So, Canada West Foundation, we created 40 years ago to give a voice for Western Canada, the 4 provinces, British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, to give the 4 Western provinces a voice in Ottawa in the formation of national policies that impacted the West. The West has a different orientation than obviously Central Canada on key issues, and also in Atlantic Canada. Yet the preponderance of policy-making weight in the country has obviously been with the demographic and industrial weight in the center part of the country. And that policy-making imbalance had negatively impacted the West. There was a real need, and there continues to be a need, for the various different needs of Western Canada, aspirations, our ability to contribute to national economy, to contribute to national prosperity, needs to be articulated in Ottawa in a way that stands with the think tanks and academic institutions that come out of central Canada. 40 years later, that mission still continues. But it's not just Ottawa where we need to have the Western interest advanced and our interest defended. It's also Washington, D.C. It's also Seoul. It's in our key foreign markets. We in the West have to be out in these markets along with the federal government advancing and defending Western interest. So my center in particular has taken on the evolution of the mission of the Canada West Foundation to be able to represent Western interest wherever they need to be represented. And you'll see us, as Doug mentioned, on CBC. I was actually on CBC Saskatchewan yesterday, Power and Politics, I think, last week. But this week, if you were to pick up a copy of El Heraldo in Mexico City, you would find their Nafta special issue, 4 pages, 5 pages, and you'd find a full page of what Nafta means for Western Canada. So we do have the ability to really, I think, impact foreign markets and foreign perceptions in key markets for us about Western Canada. So I don't know that you knew that, but
no, that's great.
Yeah, spending time, and of course my Spanish is so good that I was able to write the article in my sleep. Actually, I've got friends in the Mexican media, luckily, who can translate for me. So that's Canada West. These are some of our funders and supporters. And the businesses that back us, it's interesting to think about this in the public policy sphere. For business to influence public policy, there's a transactional nature that most businesses engage in, which is government relations, which is lobbying. It is transactional. We have an issue. We need to focus on the government. We need to find the deputy minister or the ADM or the department, and we need to present our case to them, argue with them, or otherwise lobby with the government. There are other companies, and this is a really American way of thinking, that take the longer term view. The way to influence policy is to influence the policy environment. Create an environment where deeper policy, deeper thinking is prevalent, where people take facts and evidence and use that in policy making. Policy making and the interaction with government is not a transactional interaction. It's a long-term action that requires persistence and persistent engagement, both on particular issues, as we do, but also on the policy-making environment to make sure that information flows, views are out, and that the government and key policy stakeholders have not just information, but a place to meet, convene, and exchange information. This is a unique role that think tanks play. Public policy schools do this to some degree, but think tanks do this exclusively. We don't grade papers or do other things. We focus only on building this policy environment, conducting the research, and seeing that the research gets out. So the companies and the governments that support this are those that really take a long-term view in the deeper formation of policy. And of course, the government of Saskatchewan has consistently been a supporter, but in the past, with the recent cuts, you've lost bus service here in Saskatchewan. We understand that the government's no longer here, but we still work very closely with the government regardless. We have for 40 years, and we'll probably be doing it for another 40 years. So that's a little bit about us, and this is what we're going to do in the talk today. As I mentioned, the first half is the understanding of where we are with NAFTA, mitigating, and this is what I would present to business, mitigating the fear and uncertainty, and then a deeper dive into the steps that businesses can actually take. Now, so when we developed this guide, we actually went to small businesses and we took examples of the guide, and we were able to show them as we were working on it and get impact. One of the key features was firms uniformly said that they were worried about NAFTA. They were, in essence, scared stiff, but they had no idea what to do or if they could do anything. So the thinking was, since there's nothing we can do, since every time we think about it we get upset or worried, we're just not going to deal with it. So working with the guide, we were able to work businesses through that process and get them to a point where they felt more comfortable and actually felt in control and able to do something. So that was the evolution of what we're up to. So let's start talking about the current situation with NAFTA. So I think the one word, if you had to pick with where we are with NAFTA, would be?
Uncertainty. That's how I feel.
Well, uncertainty or confusion, largely occasioned, obviously, as you can think of, by the actions of the U.S. administration. The U.S. is on a completely different page in terms of international trade, and I would argue the conduct of foreign policy and diplomacy than is practically everyone else, every other government on the planet. Slight exaggeration, perhaps, but it makes the point. The confusion is actually an operating methodology of the current government, a negotiating tactic. And you can see this in the media and the reports and things coming out. So this confusion that we have is, again, part of the cause that we're starting to look at this, this guide. So I would generally give a little bit on the renegotiation and how it got started, but I trust that with a group like this, you've already been down there, so we can save some time. But I would note that factor with negotiations, and this is something we've conveyed to business, negotiations have two facets, a public facet and a private. The public is the one that you most often hear about. You most always hear about, unless you're tied into an industry group or association that is attending the negotiations and has some inside information. The public aspect is done as spectacle. It's done to influence your domestic government, or it's done to influence your negotiating partner government. You're trying to move to domestic constituencies, you're trying to create pressure. And so the public aspect is what most of the firms hear about. But the things that you don't hear about are where progress is being made. So take agriculture with the negotiations. We've heard very little about agriculture other than supply management and the U.S. coming after Canadian supply management. If you've really followed the negotiations closely, you've heard something about seasonal agricultural produce, but you really haven't heard much about agriculture. Yet agriculture and energy are two areas where progress is reported to have been made at the negotiations. So there's a technical aspect of negotiations that you don't hear about, and the public aspect. And so we talk to business, we explain this, that progress is being made. What they're seeing in the tweets is not reflective often of what's happening behind closed doors when the ministers leave and the technical teams in the negotiations sit down and actually get to work. And that really doesn't get reported because it's boring as hell. So it doesn't make the media. You're not going to get reports on that, but you are going to get reports on the tweets and other things. And again, where we've been with the negotiations, a key point for the current talk of trying to conclude the negotiations in 2 weeks or before the Mexican elections. The reality is, again, reports coming out. The Mexican economy minister, Ildefonso Guajardo, or maybe it was the negotiator, Ken Smith, one of the two of them from Mexico said that he thinks they're close to concluding negotiations on 10 rounds. If that is indeed the case, that would put them pretty much at the halfway point in terms of the negotiations. There are 20-some chapters in NAFTA and 20-some chapters for negotiation. I'm not sure, I've lost count with gender and First Nations and the other things that are being discussed as possibly being added. But this would leave us pretty much close to halfway through the negotiations. So that's important to think about in terms of what we're hearing and what we're seeing, especially recently with trying to conclude the negotiations in a week. The election timetables. Why the governments are talking about concluding the negotiations so quickly is that we have a series of elections coming up. In Mexico, the federal elections are July 1st, presidential and congressional elections. And of course, in Mexico, you're not allowed to stand for a second term, so you'll have a large chunk of the Congress coming in as new and a new administration in Mexico. Currently, the leader of the Mexican presidential election is Andrés Manuel López Obrador, a candidate who's usually described as a left-wing populist. And that's a whole nother lecture to get into what AMLO really is and what his administration will look like. But suffice it to say, it is an administration that would be very distinct and different from the current Mexican administration. The current Mexican administration that is negotiating the Nafta agreement. So having a new administration coming into Mexico presents obvious issues. We also have the US midterm elections in November. So we have the potential of having Mexican congressional candidates, and again, think of an election, candidates running for office, fighting for seats in Mexico, talking about NAFTA, at the same time that we have US congressional elections, and we all know too well US congressional candidates in full election mode talking about NAFTA. So there are few things I can imagine that would be worse for the negotiations than having two sets of congressional elections campaigning, in essence, that overlap while we're trying to negotiate the agreement. Again, the public-private. So if you're a business and you're worried about NAFTA, this is an important piece of information, because when you turn on the news or when you're talking to suppliers or others, that environment where the congressional candidates are going at each other and scoring cheap points is one that's going to influence the news that you're getting. So you have to be aware of that, the public-private split and the role of the elections coming in. Also, the Trade Promotion Authority timeline is a key factor in NAFTA negotiations, something we really haven't talked about. You'll only see occasional mentions in the media about the TPA, and we'll talk about that in depth in a second. Well, actually right now. So, in the US, so backing up a second here to, again, it takes a while to get through this with business, but in the US, trade and management of trade is a congressional responsibility. Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, the Commerce Clause. Congress, not Congress and the President, not Congress in consultation with the administration, not Congress in consultation with the judiciary, Congress shall have the power to regulate trade between the states and the Indian nations, and between the U.S. and foreign nations. And that's pretty much close to the original language in the Constitution. So if Congress is responsible for the regulation of trade, why do we have the President and the administration negotiating? Well, because under the Constitution, the President's responsible for foreign relations, including negotiations. So this tension between the President being responsible for foreign relations and negotiating treaties. Trade agreements aren't treaties or agreements, but for negotiation purposes, they're treated the same. Having the President actually have to do the negotiations and Congress responsible for trade is mitigated by something called the Trade Promotion Authority. In essence, Congress allows the President to take the power to set the rules for trade and negotiate terms with foreign governments in exchange for the President agreeing to a set of conditions that Congress imposes, including setting priorities for trade that the administration has to agree to try and follow and try and negotiate, timelines for when Congress has to be notified, when reviews have to be done, and in the end, Congress promises to give the President a simple up or down vote. So rather than having a trade agreement arrive and Congress picking it apart, changing it, adding things, and fighting over it, Congress can only, as a result of this process, vote up or down on the agreement. So this is how the U.S. manages this tension between Congress and the President on trade. So what does this look like? In the case of the trade negotiations, the administration has to give Congress 90 days notice of its intent to begin negotiations. So what happened with the Trump administration when they came in? Well, Secretary Ross gets appointed fairly early on and confirmed as Commerce Secretary. He goes to Congress, actually to the Senate Finance Committee, which is in charge of trade under the TPA, and states that the administration would like to, or is planning to renegotiate NAFTA. The response of the committee is, fine, when are you going to give us notice? Secretary Ross's response is, well, isn't this notice? And the response from the Senate Finance Committee, and especially Senator Wyden, the ranking Democrat, was to pretty much put his head in his hands and just shake it back and forth. Say, no, go back and look at the TPA legislation and what has to be done. We need a response to the things we laid out in the legislation, how you intend to pursue it, what your goals are. So Secretary Ross goes away. He comes back, I think a month later, with Lighthizer, who has been nominated to serve as the U.S. Trade Representative, which is the official that, under the TPA, is in charge of negotiations. So he comes back with Lighthizer, who hasn't been for a hearing yet, and says, okay, we're ready to submit. We've got a draft of a letter. We're ready to go. And the response from Senator Wyden and the committee is, no, go back and read the goddamn legislation. We are not going to take a submission to renegotiate a trade agreement from an acting USTR. So it took the Trump administration 2 or 3 times to simply figure this out and to come in and to get it right. So this says a bit about the U.S. administration. It also says a bit about the potential power of the TPA. But here's another point. If you notice, when negotiations end, the time periods till you can actually have legislation in front of Congress, for Congress to actually vote on it, for it to be reviewed, a check to see that the other parties to the agreement are adhering and have enacted legislation, and then for it to finally come into effect. So if you think that we're able to conclude negotiations in June, say by some miracle, you can do the math to figure out when the agreement would come in, and you can figure out that the Mexican elections are over, take place in July, the new Congress is seated in September, the new president is seated at the end of December, and you can play with the timelines to figure out what sort of problems you'll be running into with the elections. So the TPA is something we don't talk about often, but this is hugely important. These dates, the ones that are in solid lines are not movable. Some of the other ones, in terms of reviews and studies, is the maximum amount of time you can take to do a study. Obviously, if you want to cram a study through faster, you can cut those a little bit. But there are hard limits to how fast it can come in. So this is something else to think about. Just because negotiations are concluded doesn't mean it immediately goes to Congress and it's immediately voted upon and it comes into effect. There is a longer period, and there's a potential for Congress in the hearings and the studies to generate opposition to the agreement. So it's not signing the agreement, certainly isn't a slam dunk in the case of the U.S. So, bottom line, what could happen with the negotiations? Obviously, the negotiations can conclude at any time. Canada and Mexico could simply roll over on their backs, put their paws up in the air and say, okay, we're finished. We'll take whatever you put on the table. We'll sign it. Outside of that scenario, something that's actually in the realm of possible or realistic is Trump pulling the plug on Nafta because he's frustrated with the negotiations, because he's seen something on Fox News, and again, it's only slightly facetious, or other factors that come in. It's 50-50. It always has been with Donald Trump. He said that he may stay in the negotiations if they're going well, or he may pull out if he feels they're not. He may sign the agreement if he thinks it's good, or he may not if it's bad. That 50-50 is something we haven't encountered before. President Obama, during his first run for office, also talked about ripping up NAFTA. I was actually in D.C. with his guy turned out to be his chief of staff, Dennis McDonough, where Dennis was saying, oh yeah, as soon as we get elected, we're going to rip that sucker up and tear it apart. And Hillary Clinton's chief foreign policy advisor, Mac McClarty, was just about fell on the floor when he heard the Obama guy say this. So this threat to rip up NAFTA has been on the table of previous administrations, but actually ripping it up, the potential that it actually may be ripped up is something new for us. And that's why it's moved to the 50-50 realm. And in fact, Donald Trump has the withdrawal papers signed and in his desk. This is also the case with the Korea-U.S. agreement. I get this from friends of mine in D.C. Who actually would know. And I have every reason to take them at their word. Also, reporters from the trade publications in Washington are saying the same thing privately. So the potential to pull out is real. There's also potential that the president attempts to pull out to trigger the 60-day withdrawal notice to force Canada and Mexico back to the table to put pressure on us, sort of an end game if they get close. The other possibility, and one that's emerged more recently, is that the president pulls out of NAFTA to prevent Congress from having a plan B if they don't like the agreement that he's negotiated. So the withdrawal takes the current NAFTA off the table and leaves the negotiated text by the administration as the only option. And for Congress people who have constituencies like the agricultural community who are scared to death about the end of NAFTA but may not like some things with the new agreement, this would leave them with nothing but the newly negotiated agreement. So these are the types of calculations that are being made. And this was Robert Lighthizer, I think last week or maybe a week and a half ago, was quoted, actually interviewed and quoted as saying that the administration was thinking about this. Again, it was a half thought. He was thinking as he was speaking, it seemed. But still, this is actually on the table. So these are some possibilities of what could happen. At the end, I see the negotiations going to 2020. I don't see the Americans pulling out. The U.S. agricultural community is scared to death